interesting Mother's Day this is going to be, huh? We're going to be making some changes, I think, to our usual traditions. Brunch, I think, is out of the question unless there's some kind of a speakeasy joint open somewhere. Karen and I had that conversation this morning. I mean, somebody must be doing some kind of stuff like that underground, but anyway, there's going to be some changes, and even where Mom and the rest of the family are living in the same area, some folks might still opt to use Zoom or Facebook or whatever just to make sure that Mom stays healthy. So it might be a little more challenging to find the right and perfect way to celebrate Mom, but that just means we have to be a little more creative. I think that's something that we're all capable of. I was going to do a brief history of Mother's Day. I'd written something down, and then this morning, something I do every morning is I listen to a program online called the Writer's Almanac, which is put out by Garrison Keillor of the old Prairie Home Companion radio show. And the Almanac this morning had a very interesting history of Mother's Day with some bits and things that I didn't know. And so I'm going to go ahead and share this from the Writer's Almanac this morning, talking about Mother's Day. Today is Mother's Day, and Mother's Day, as we know it, where we celebrate our own mothers with flowers, gifts, and cards, is relatively new. But annual celebrations to celebrate motherhood are an ancient practice. The motherhood festivities have historically been in spring, which is the season of fertility, and in ancient Egypt there were celebrations to honor Isis, the loving mother goddess. The cult of the great mother goddess Sybil began in Turkey and soon moved to Greece and Rome, where she was worshipped in some form for more than 1,000 years. Her priestesses led wild celebrations full of drinking, dancing, music, and all kinds of debauchery. And as the Roman Empire in Europe transitioned to Christianity, the church set aside the fourth Sunday of Lent as a day to honor motherhood. It was a day to celebrate the Virgin Mary and for people to honor their mother church. So I'm sensing ulterior motives there, but in the 1600s, England declared an official Mothering Day for that fourth Sunday of Lent, and it was a time when families were encouraged to get together, and servants or workers were allowed one day off work. They didn't get many days off. They got one day off work to presumably go see their mothers, since many working class families in England worked as servants on separate estates and rarely got to see each other. Mothering Day was also declared an exception to the fasting and penance of Lent, so that families could then have a feast together. Now, when the Pilgrims came to America, they stopped celebrating Mothering Day, just as they stopped celebrating most holidays that they thought had become too secular, and that includes Christmas. Someone once said that the definition of a Puritan is someone who lives in fear that someone somewhere just might be having a good time. So they dropped all the celebrations, including Mother's Day. Mother's Day was reintroduced to America in 1870 by Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, I believe. She wanted to set aside a day of protest after the Civil War in which mothers could come together and protest their sons killing other mothers' sons. In other words, it got back into swing as a peace movement. But of course, the woman who really created Mother's Day as we know it was Anna Jarvis. Her mother had held Mother's Friendship Days to reunite families and neighbors who were separated during the war. And when she died, her daughter, Anna Jarvis, worked to proclaim an official Mother's Day to honor her mother and celebrate peace. And so, on May 10th, 1908, the first official Mother's Day celebrations took place in Grafton, West Virginia, and at a church in Philadelphia. And finally, in 1914, it was Woodrow Wilson who designated the second Sunday of May as Mother's Day. So as they say, you may not be a mother, but everyone has a mother. So at the very least, everyone has a reason to reflect on their relationship with their mother and maybe think of perhaps some of the interesting things she used to say. For example, I found a few interesting reminiscences, some little stories from folks online that they've shared about moms and children. This first one is from Susan Savannah, who gave this bit of advice to mothers. She says, if your kids are giving you a headache, follow the directions on the aspirin bottle, especially the part that says, keep away from children. This memory is from Jeff Shaw. Oh, I remember this. Jeff Shaw, who says, when I was a boy, my mother wore a mood ring. Remember mood rings? When she was in a good mood, it turned blue. In a bad mood, it left a big red mark on my forehead. This one from the late, great Phyllis Diller, who said, I want my children to have all the things I couldn't afford. Then I want to move in with them. And finally, one of my all-time favorites from the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. Calvin is talking to his tiger friend Hobbes, and he says, I asked Mom if I was a gifted child, and she said they certainly wouldn't have paid for me. I can see from the look on Calvin's face up there that he has a pretty good idea that that wasn't a compliment. Ah, yes, memories. And you know, one of the interesting things about Mother's Day is that when it first started back in 1914, obviously they wanted to honor mothers, but moms couldn't vote in 1914. We could honor and we could celebrate the biological fact of motherhood, and we can acknowledge the important role that women played in raising children, but they were still basically second-class citizens. Quite a disconnect, don't you think? We singled out motherhood as the only achievement that was worthy of our celebration and respect, but we couldn't give women the right to vote until 4 years later. And even after that, there were all sorts of customs and rules that denied true equality to women. It seems as if beyond the role of mother, the world was unwilling or unable to acknowledge and celebrate the contributions of women beyond that biological imperative. Back in those days, you were expected to get married and bear children, and women really didn't have any choice in the matter. There wasn't much they could do about it until the birth control pill came out in the early 1960s. So that's why I want to see Mother's Day expanded a bit, at least to include other achievements and contributions. And this I think, is especially important for the people who maybe never knew their biological mother or had no meaningful relationship with a nurturing mother figure, or maybe, as Karen was speaking of in the meditation this morning, had a difficult or dysfunctional relationship with their mother. So for that reason, I'd like to add another possibility for Mother's Day. Let's include women role models who inspire us. And many of them, if you think about it, probably most of them, they had to combine the work of being a mother along with all of the other noteworthy things that they were accomplishing and achieving that they didn't get credit for, which I think is even more reason to pay attention to their other achievements. And then they can serve as inspiration and role models for all of us. Now here's a name that I hadn't heard of until just this last week. And again, this came to me on the Writer's Almanac on the date of her birth, which was May 7th, 1948. Her name is, and this is French, I'm going to give it a shot here, Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges. Born in 1748 in France, leading up in the years leading up to the French Revolution. She was considered a part of what they called the bourgeois class, so that means that she was educated well enough so that she could become a well-known playwright in the 1780s. Unfortunately, her social status didn't prevent her from being forced into an arranged marriage when she was 16 years old. In one of her books, she described the relationship like this. She said, I was married to a man I did not love, who was neither rich nor well-born. I was sacrificed for no reason that could make up for the repugnance I felt for this man. Now, I don't know if I should use the word fortunately, but he died a year into the marriage, leaving her a single mother, and she vowed never to marry again. I suspect that experience was a major reason why she became best known in those days as one of the early advocates of women's rights. She wrote pamphlets, essays, satirical plays, and all sorts of things like that that made fun of the monarchy and different things like that, demanding that French women have the same rights as French men. And she was also, and this seems to go together somehow, women's rights advocates also tended to be outspoken abolitionists. She was one of the earliest opponents to the French slave trade, and she wrote an entire play about it. But her best-known writing was entitled Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. This document actually became influential during the American suffrage movement. They used it as the model for the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments that came from the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. So she was known in America, she was known in the rest of Europe, and she was initially a supporter of the French Revolution because she thought that just by some chance that the motto of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, would apply to women as well. Of course, she probably could have gotten a clue from the word fraternity, which excludes women in its own terms, but she thought that maybe the equality aspect might apply to women, but that turned out to be wrong. And of course, the French Revolution soon gave way to the Reign of Terror. And even though she supported many of the ideals of the revolution, she made the big mistake of opposing the execution of King Louis. One of the reasons was because she was opposed to the death penalty on principle. And then she became entangled with a disagreement with the revolutionary government. She openly criticized them, which was something that you did not do back in those days. And for that, she was arrested, put on trial, and executed by guillotine in 1793. It appears that she was the only woman to be executed for her political writings during the French Revolution, which makes her one of the few women ever to have paid the ultimate price for advocating women's rights. Now, I promise that from here on out, the stories will have happier endings, but I think her courage and her integrity are something that more people need to be aware of. And I thought it was an interesting story, and it was someone who I was happy to hear about. All right, the next person I want to mention is somebody who's maybe a bit more well-known, especially in the Chicago area where I grew up. Her name is Jane Addams. She was an author. She was an early pioneer in the field of social work. She was a leader in the suffrage movement, and she was an advocate for world peace. But she's best known as being the founder of an organization called Hull House, which was one of the first and most famous settlement houses in the United States. And when Jane Addams died in 1935, she was the best known female public figure in America. And if you live in the Chicago area for any length of time, at some point you will hear the story of Hull House. It was an organization that existed until 2012, and the original settlement house buildings are now a historic landmark and a museum. Okay, so she got the idea for a settlement house in Chicago after visiting London, and she saw something called Toynbee Hall, which is regarded as the first settlement house. It was part of something called the settlement movement in England that was designed to serve as a social safety net for people back in those days. They established these settlement houses in poor neighborhoods where volunteer middle-class settlement workers would actually go to live. This was an actual house that people would go to live. And the idea was that they would live among these people and they would share knowledge and culture and become neighbors with their low-income friends that they ordinarily wouldn't get to know or to even see because of the class system and the way people lived in different neighborhoods. And these settlement houses would provide services such as daycare, education, and health care. And the idea was to improve the lives of the poor in those areas. But they also served this much larger and I think equally valuable purpose of bringing people together. bringing people together who had these diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, diverse cultures. It served as sort of a mutual cultural exchange, and this must have been especially helpful in immigrant communities. And I think this is probably one of the big reasons why Chicago has such a rich and varied cultural heritage. If you go to Chicago, you're going to find Little Italy, Greek Town, Chinatown, and all sorts of other diverse cultural neighborhoods. They all get along together, they preserve their cultural heritage, and yet they're a vital part of the overall culture and life in Chicago. It's a great thing. And Jane Addams has a very impressive list of firsts associated with her name. She was the first woman to receive an honorary degree from Yale. She was the first woman, the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She's regarded as the founder of the social work profession in the United States, and she was the co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union. Now, according to her biography in Wikipedia, she helped America address and focus on issues that were of concern to mothers, such as the needs of children, local public health, and of course, world peace. And I'm just scratching the surface here this morning of her accomplishments. I'm amazed by her seemingly boundless energy. She went on the lecture circuit teaching. She had guest lectures at all the major universities and was constantly traveling. I'm surprised they haven't made a movie about her life yet. I guess that's something more to look forward to. So that's Jane Addams. And our final role model for today isn't just one person. There are several contemporary women who are part of this worldwide movement I want to talk about here briefly, which goes by the name of girls' education. Girls' education. This next quote was written by a man. Our friend Hans Rosling, the author of Factfulness, but he puts it so well that I need to quote him here. This is what he said. Educating girls has proven to be one of the world's best ever ideas. When women are educated, all kinds of wonderful things happen in societies. The workforce becomes diversified and able to make better decisions and solve more problems. Educated mothers decide to have fewer children, and more children survive. It's a virtuous cycle of change. Poor parents who can't afford to send all their children to school have often prioritized the boys. But since 1970, there has been fantastic progress. Across religions, cultures, and continents, almost all parents can now afford to send all their children to school and are sending their daughters as well as their sons. Now the girls have almost caught up. 90% of girls of primary school age attend school. For boys, the figure is 92%. There's almost no difference. What an accomplishment. A couple of statistics here. This shows the graph, girls in school going from 65% in 1970 up to 90% in 2015, and I hope that that's gotten better in the 5 years since then. And then here's a graph showing literacy rates. Male and female literacy rates have almost equalized. I think that's fantastic news. And I think probably the best known advocate for girls' education, of course, is Malala. I think you're probably familiar with her tragic story with a happy ending finally. But when she was 15 years old, she was riding home on a school bus, and the Taliban stopped the bus, got on board, and shot her, along with some other people, because she spoke in opposition to the Taliban policy of banning girls from attending school. Fortunately, she didn't have to pay the ultimate price. It took a long time, but after a long recovery, she became an even more powerful and vocal activist for education rights. And I think a movement like this, first and foremost, needs the people in the trenches like Malala. They need the people who are out there really putting it all on the line. But it also helps to have a couple other forms of support and advocacy. Sometimes it helps to have some big names, and it often helps to have some big money. Y'all might remember Emma Watson. Let's see if we have Emma up here. Emma Watson, who played Hermione in the Harry Potter films. This is a then and now slide. She's all grown up. And in this next slide, here she is interviewing Malala. That's because Emma is a goodwill ambassador for something called United Nations Women, the United Nations organization that's dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women. And so in that role, she launched a campaign called He for She. He for She, which seeks to engage men and boys in removing the social and cultural barriers that prevent women and girls' full participation in society. So Emma Watson, I would say, is arguably a big name in the entertainment business. And when it comes to big money, well, we have Melinda Gates, who again is shown with Malala. You have Melinda Gates, who has brought the enormous wealth of the Gates Foundation to support the cause of educating girls. And there was a book that she wrote. It was released last year. The book was called The Moment of Lift: How Empowering Women Changes the World. And of course, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for a while. And she says that equality for women is one of the goals, but not the only one. She says the goal is for everyone to be connected. The goal is for everyone to belong. The goal is for everyone to be loved. That means all of us. So consider adding this book to your wish list, your gift list for yourself, and especially for a young person in your life who might benefit from some of these inspiring stories. And that's all for now. Happy Mother's Day. Remember your mom and take some time to get to know a little bit more about some of the other inspiring women that we've talked about on this special day. And of course, all of the information that we had up there on the screen is available on the blog that is on the homepage, www.unityofauburn.com, so you can look at the notes and the different information there. So that's all for today, and we'll see you next week.